UFC Fight Night, Dariush versus Sarukian just went down from the Moody Center in Austin, Texas. What a crazy card this was. A bunch of wild finishes, some crazy comebacks, a lot of incorrect picks from me. Nonetheless, this is Casual Roundhouse Fight Talk. We're going to recap this card from the first prelim to the main event. First fight on the card, Veronica Hardy winning a decision over Jamie Lynn Horth. Hardy dished out more damage in the shining moments of the fight despite Lynn Horth forcing the action and making the fight competitive. She was more focused on forcing the clinch and controlling Hardy, which Hardy didn't allow. It's a good win for Hardy, and now she's on a 2-fight win streak. It was a good tone to open up this card. This follow-up fight between Wellington Turman and Jared Gooden was absolutely nuts. I did say that it would be worth taking a Jared Gooden underdog bet, so if you did sprinkle on that and won some money, good on you. Nonetheless, like I said, this fight was nuts. Turman was landing early and often, stopping Gooden in his tracks at times, but Gooden forced a brawl, knowing he was losing the fight, and caught Turman with a left hook that hurt him really bad. And he continued to beat on Turman as the fight made its way to the ground. And honestly, the fight really should have and could have been stopped sooner than it was. But nonetheless, Gooden eventually found a submission, and it's an impressive win in a really fun scrap for the second fight of the card. The follow-up fight was wild as well. Rodolfo Bellato versus Ihor Potieria. Potieria was sticking and moving early, landing hard shots and using his footwork to stay safe, but Bellato would just eat all of that and continue to walk Potieria down. And the second round was even more nuts because Potieria dropped Bellato with a sequence of strikes, and despite multiple attempted hammer fists, Bellato was actively looking for submissions off of his back before eventually working his way back up to his feet. And at this point, he began to slowly impose his will on Potieria, and Bellato secured a takedown and made his way into mount, and what followed was just a barrage of ground and pound strikes that gave Bellato the TKO stoppage. But it's a win where he took way too much damage in getting this win. So, couple of things to look back on in this performance. Nonetheless, it's still a comeback TKO for Rodolfo Bellato. Drakkar Klose versus Joe Solecki. This and the Cody Brundage versus Zachary Reese fight both ended in the same way with somewhat different circumstances. But I did say for the Drakkar Klose versus Joe Solecki fight that Joe Solecki, despite being an underdog, was somebody to favor, and he was giving Drakkar Klose trouble on the ground. He was utilizing his guard. He had a very deep armbar in that looked like it was about to cause a submission, but Drakkar Klose literally picked Solecki up and slammed him on the side of his head and knocked him out cold to get a finish. I said in my previous upload that Drakkar Klose is a wild man, and this finish just proves it. And then just when you think it can't get any more wild, Cody Brundage is like, you know what? I can do that too. And he came out very aggressive against Zachary Reese, landing a combination early before forcing Reese to the ground. And Reese was very aggressive off his back, throwing up kicks as well as throwing up submissions. And he found Cody Brundage in a very tight triangle. So Brundage decides to lift Zachary Reese off the ground and slam him on the side of his head. And compared to the Drakkar Klose finish, Klose did not follow up with any ground and pound strikes, whereas Cody Brundage did. And nonetheless, Cody Brundage's back was against the wall going into this fight, and I think that gave him a little bit of fire beneath his bottom. And it's an impressive win for Brundage, and just absolute madness as this prelim card progressed. Wild segue into the featured prelim between Miesha Tate and Julia Avila, where Miesha Tate was dominant over 3 rounds, utilizing her bread and butter with her wrestling, and honestly made a case for a 10-8 round before finding that rear naked choke. It's a great bounce-back win for a former champion who, going in, was an underdog, which is sort of surprising considering Julia Avila's resume. We move on to the main card. This was another fight that I was entirely wrong on in terms of my picks from the previous upload. Punahele Soriano versus Dustin Stoltzfus. Soriano did look good early, finding the mark with his left hand, but it got to a point where the left hand was legitimately probably the only thing he would throw, and it enabled Stoltzfus to make reads and offer counters, which he was finding success with. And he even dropped Soriano with a right hand at the end of the first round. And right before this fight started, I was thinking to myself, if this fight goes late, Soriano's probably going to keep swinging that hammer of a left hand, and he'll overswing and put himself out of position, and Stoltzfus is more than likely going to take his back and take advantage of that. And that's exactly what wound up happening. I have a clip of it on my TikTok just in case people decide to comment and be like, oh, you didn't actually say that. But, like, I'll openly admit in my last video that I said I thought Punahele Soriano would win. And right before this fight started, I was like, stylistically, nonetheless. Impressive bounce back win for Stoltzfus off the Abus Magomedov loss. And he took everything that Soriano gave him and worked off of it very effectively. Good win for Stoltzfus, like I said. Clay Guida versus Joaquim Silva. Guida put forth his quintessential grimy, grueling pace, testing an upcoming talent in Joaquim Silva, but Silva had more success on the feet, landing more damage along with neutralizing Guida's wrestling down the stretch and having an answer for Guida on the feet whenever Clay Guida would land any kind of combination early, because Guida was landing good combinations with his hands early on, but as the fight progressed, Silva was separating himself. I redeemed myself with this pick. But Sean Brady versus Kelvin Gastelum, complete opposite, because Brady showed pure dominance for 12 minutes straight before securing that Kimura submission, and I'll openly admit I counted Brady out following his loss to Bilal Muhammad, along with the momentum that Kelvin carried into this fight. I thought that would play a factor, and it did not at all. Brady was dominant. He reinserts himself as a legitimate contender at welterweight, and I hope that Kelvin Gastelum stays at welterweight because I think there's plenty of good fights for him, and I still think he has potential to work his way up into the rankings eventually. Rob Font versus Deiveson Figueiredo. Despite this being a competitive fight for its duration, Figueiredo landed the more damaging shots down the stretch and throughout, wobbling Font multiple times. Despite Font also wobbling Figueiredo, it was not nearly as often as Figueiredo. On top of Figgy also mixing in the body work and the takedowns, it was an impressive bantamweight debut for the former flyweight champion against a legit tough test in Rob Font. Tough loss for Rob Font. This was another fight that I picked Font in just because of the Puerto Rican ties. I think the UFC is going to try and match Font up against somebody under him in the rankings again who's an up-and-coming talent, and I think one more win for Figueiredo at bantamweight could leap him right into title contention. The co-main event, strap yourselves in. Bobby Green versus Jalen Turner. So Green initially tried to lure Turner into a counter, doing his typical early hands down, bark at his opponent approach, and it worked initially, but Jalen was landing punches of his own, and one of them wobbled Green badly, and Turner landed a follow-up shot that put Green straight to the canvas, and this is probably where the fight should have been stopped. But instead, Kerry Hatley, the official for this one, allowed Bobby Green to get defenselessly assaulted while basically unconscious, with Jalen Turner dropping ground and pound on the back of his head for at least another 5 seconds before the ref woke up and realized that there had just been irreversible damage done to Bobby Green, and this may have permanently ruined Bobby Green's ability to take a punch. It's a great win for Jalen Turner, but it's completely overshadowed by the horrible officiating that we saw in this fight. And the main event, Beneil Dariush versus Arman Tsarukyan. Very quick fight. I said leading up, Tsarukyan had that aggression and ferocity in his style that I felt as though would potentially overwhelm Beneil. And the sequence that ended the fight was just that, because he threw a right hand that potentially glanced the back of Beneil's head, not the back of Beneil's head, but behind his ear. And as that punch was thrown, Arman went to lock up a clinch to throw a knee, and the knee missed because Beneil pulled away. But as he was pulling away, Arman was already throwing that right hand follow-up, and it landed flush and sent Beneil to the ground. A couple ground and pound shots followed up, and the finish was inevitable. First round TKO for Arman Tsarukyan. He definitely propelled himself into making a case for being a title contender with this win. There's not that many options in terms of future matchups for Tsarukyan outside of a title shot, considering his only losses in the UFC are to the current champion and Gamrot. But let me know who you guys think the big winners of this card should fight next in the comments. I appreciate you guys sitting through this ramble session as usual. This has been Casual Roundhouse Fight Talk for the recap of UFC Fight Night Tsarukyan versus Dariush. I appreciate you watching again, and we'll see you in the next one.